Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera wiped the sweat from his forehead as he crouched behind the crumbling concrete wall. The morning sun blazed down on the abandoned city of Kandahar, turning the desert landscape into a furnace. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of gunfire echoing through the empty streets. Marcus had been stationed in Afghanistan for 8 months now, but nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead this day. His unit, Delta Company, had received intelligence about a high-value target hiding in a compound deep within enemy territory. What was supposed to be a routine extraction mission was about to become the fight of his life. The convoy had been moving through the narrow streets when the first explosion rocked their Humvee. Marcus remembered the deafening blast, the screaming metal, and the acrid smell of smoke filling his lungs. When the dust settled, he found himself alone, separated from his squad, surrounded by hostile territory, with nothing but his rifle, limited ammunition, and years of training to keep him alive. He checked his equipment methodically, the way his drill sergeant had taught him back in basic training. His M4 carbine was intact. He had 3 magazines remaining. His radio was damaged beyond repair, and his left shoulder throbbed from where he had been thrown against the vehicle during the explosion. Blood trickled down his arm, but he ignored the pain. Survival was his only priority now. The compound where the target was believed to be hiding stood 3 blocks away, a fortress-like structure surrounded by high walls and watchtowers. Intelligence had suggested minimal resistance, but Marcus could see movement in the windows and shadows darting between buildings. The enemy knew they were coming, and they were ready. Marcus studied the terrain carefully. The streets were littered with debris from years of conflict. Burned-out cars provided cover, but also created choke points where he could easily be trapped. The buildings on either side rose like canyon walls, their windows dark and threatening. Any one of them could conceal a sniper or an entire squad of enemy fighters. He thought about his team, wondering if any of them had survived the blast. Corporal Johnson, who always shared his rations with the local children, Private Martinez, who carried photos of his newborn daughter in his helmet, Sergeant Thompson, who had saved Marcus's life during their first firefight 6 months ago. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he pushed the thoughts aside. He had a mission to complete. The intel package had been clear about the target. Hassan al-Mahmoud, a bomb maker responsible for attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces and hundreds of civilians. The man was planning something big, something that could change the course of the conflict in this region. Marcus couldn't let him escape. Moving from cover to cover, Marcus began his advance toward the compound. Every step was calculated. Every movement deliberate. He used techniques learned in urban warfare training, staying low, checking corners, listening for the slightest sound that might indicate an ambush. The heat was oppressive, and his gear felt heavier with each passing minute. The first contact came without warning. A burst of automatic fire erupted from a second-story window, sending chips of concrete flying around his position. Marcus rolled behind an overturned truck, his heart pounding. He could hear voices shouting in a language he didn't understand, but their tone was clear enough. They had found him. Peering around the edge of his cover, Marcus spotted the muzzle flash from the window. He took careful aim and fired 3 controlled bursts. The shooting stopped, but he knew it was only temporary. Where there was one enemy fighter, there would be more. His suspicions were confirmed moments later when gunfire erupted from multiple positions: windows, rooftops, doorways. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had come alive with hostile activity. Marcus found himself pinned down, outnumbered, with nowhere to run. He thought about the radio call that would never come, the backup that wouldn't arrive, the extraction that was no longer possible. Standard protocol would be to fall back, regroup, and wait for reinforcements. But Marcus knew that by the time help arrived, the target would be long gone, and more innocent people would die. The decision crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. He was going forward, alone if necessary. The mission came first, just as he had been taught. Personal survival was secondary to completing the objective. It was a principle that had been drilled into him during countless hours of training. But this was the first time he would have to live it in reality. Marcus checked his ammunition again. 2.5 magazines left. He would have to make every shot count. The compound was still 2 blocks away, and between him and his objective lay an urban battlefield where every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. He waited for a lull in the gunfire, then sprinted across the street to a new position behind a concrete barrier. Bullets whined overhead as he moved, some coming close enough that he could feel the heat of their passage. His training kicked in, suppressing the fear and focusing his mind on the tactical situation. From his new position, Marcus could see more clearly into the compound. Armed figures moved between the buildings, and he counted at least a dozen fighters. This wasn't the minimal resistance that intelligence had predicted. Someone had leaked information about the mission, or the enemy had been expecting them for other reasons. A movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. 3 fighters were attempting to flank him, moving through the rubble of a collapsed building to his right. Marcus shifted his position, keeping low as he maneuvered to counter their advance. The urban environment worked both ways. It provided cover for his enemies, but it also gave him opportunities to use superior training and tactics against superior numbers. The flanking maneuver failed when Marcus spotted them early and took position behind a concrete pillar that gave him a clear field of fire. When the first fighter exposed himself, Marcus was ready. A single, well-placed shot dropped the man instantly. The other 2 took cover, but their position was compromised. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus fought a running battle through the streets. He would fire from one position, then immediately move to another before return fire could find him. The enemy fighters were numerous but poorly coordinated, often shooting at positions he had already abandoned. His superior marksmanship training began to show results. Every shot he fired was aimed and controlled, while his enemies sprayed bullets wildly in his general direction. Gradually, the volume of incoming fire decreased as his accurate shooting took its toll, but ammunition was becoming a critical concern. Marcus was down to his last magazine, and the compound still seemed impossibly far away. He needed to change tactics, to find a way to reach his objective without engaging every enemy fighter between his current position and the target. Studying the surrounding buildings, Marcus identified a possible route. A partially collapsed apartment building offered concealment and elevation, potentially allowing him to bypass the heaviest concentration of enemy fighters on the street level. The building looked unstable, its upper floors damaged by previous bombing, but it might hold his weight long enough to get him closer to the compound. The climb was treacherous. Broken stairs, exposed rebar, and unstable floors made every step a potential disaster. Several times, Marcus had to test each foothold carefully before trusting his full weight to it. Below, he could hear enemy fighters searching for him, their voices growing more frustrated as they failed to locate their elusive target. From the 3rd floor of the damaged building, Marcus had his first clear view of the compound's interior courtyard. He could see armed guards patrolling the perimeter and movement within the main building that suggested significant activity. His target was definitely inside, but reaching him would require penetrating multiple layers of defense. As Marcus planned his next move, an explosion in the distance caught his attention. Black smoke rose from the direction where his convoy had been ambushed. Either his teammates were fighting their way out, or the enemy was destroying evidence. Either way, it reminded him that time was running out. Marcus descended from the damaged building under cover of afternoon shadows, his military boots making minimal sound on the debris-strewn floor. The heat had become nearly unbearable, and his water supply was running dangerously low. Sweat stung his eyes as he surveyed the compound that now lay just 50 meters away. The intelligence briefing had mentioned underground tunnels connecting several buildings in this district. Marcus remembered the satellite photos showing suspicious entrances and ventilation shafts. If he could locate one of these tunnel entrances, he might be able to approach the compound without exposing himself to the numerous guards patrolling the perimeter. Moving carefully through the rubble of what had once been a marketplace, Marcus searched for any sign of the reported tunnel system. The vendors' stalls had been destroyed months ago, leaving behind twisted metal and broken concrete that provided excellent concealment. He found what he was looking for behind the remnants of a fruit stand, a metal grate partially hidden by debris. The tunnel was narrow and dark, clearly hand-dug and reinforced with salvaged materials. Marcus had to crawl on his hands and knees, pushing his rifle ahead of him. The confined space triggered memories of cave fighting exercises during training, but this was far more dangerous. If he encountered enemy fighters in here, there would be no room to maneuver and limited options for retreat. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Marcus reached a junction where the tunnel branched in 3 directions. Faint light filtered down from above through a drainage grate, and he could hear voices speaking in hushed tones. He was directly beneath the compound's outer courtyard. Listening carefully, Marcus identified at least 2 guards positioned nearby. Their conversation suggested they were nervous, probably because of the gunfight that had erupted earlier when his convoy was ambushed. This worked in his favor. Nervous guards made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. Marcus waited until the voices moved away, then carefully lifted the drainage grate just enough to peer through. The compound's layout matched the intelligence photos, with the main building directly ahead and guard towers at each corner. However, there were more fighters than expected, at least 20 that he could see from his limited vantage point. The building where his target was located stood 3 stories tall, with reinforced walls and barred windows. Getting inside would require careful planning and perfect timing. Marcus noted the patrol patterns of the guards, identifying a brief window when the rear entrance would be momentarily unobserved. He replaced the grate and continued through the tunnel system, following what he hoped was a branch that led toward the main building. The air grew thicker and more stifling with each meter he crawled. His shoulder wound had reopened during the climb through the damaged building, and blood loss was beginning to affect his concentration. The tunnel emerged in the basement of an adjacent building that had been partially destroyed in earlier fighting. Marcus found himself in what had once been a storage room, now filled with rubble and debris. Through a hole in the wall, he could see directly into the compound's main building. This was his chance. Marcus checked his remaining ammunition one final time. 8 rounds in his current magazine, plus 1 spare magazine with 30 rounds. Not much for what he was about to attempt, but it would have to be enough. Moving through the hole in the wall, Marcus entered the compound's main building through its damaged rear section. The interior was dimly lit and filled with the smell of cooking food and cigarette smoke. He could hear multiple voices from the floors above, suggesting significant activity throughout the building. Marcus moved like a ghost through the ground floor, using techniques learned in close-quarters combat training. Each room was cleared methodically, but he encountered no resistance. The fighters were either on the upper floors or positioned outside as perimeter guards. A staircase led to the 2nd floor, but Marcus hesitated. Going up would commit him to a direct confrontation with unknown numbers of enemy fighters. Once he started climbing, there would be no turning back. The element of surprise was his only advantage, and he could use it only once. Before ascending, Marcus conducted a final equipment check. His rifle was cleaned and ready, spare magazine easily accessible, and his tactical knife secured but available if needed. He thought briefly about the letters he had written to his family but never sent, letters that were probably destroyed in the convoy ambush. The stairs creaked ominously under his weight, despite his efforts to move silently. Marcus paused at each step, listening for any indication that his presence had been detected. The voices from above continued their normal cadence, suggesting he remained unnoticed. On the 2nd floor, Marcus encountered his first real resistance. A guard emerged from a side room, without warning, assault rifle in hand. Training and reflexes took over as Marcus engaged the fighter in close-quarters combat. The confrontation was brief but intense, ending with the guard neutralized but not before he managed to shout a warning. The building erupted into chaos. Footsteps pounded on floors above and below as fighters responded to the alarm. Marcus found himself trapped on the 2nd floor, with enemy forces converging on his position from multiple directions. He took cover in what appeared to be a former office, using an overturned desk for protection as automatic weapons fire filled the air. Bullets shredded the walls around him, filling the air with concrete dust and splinters. The volume of fire was overwhelming, but most of it was poorly aimed due to the panic and confusion of the defenders. Marcus returned fire selectively, making each shot count. His superior marksmanship training paid dividends as he methodically engaged targets that exposed themselves. The enemy fighters were brave but undisciplined, often exposing themselves unnecessarily in their eagerness to locate and eliminate the intruder. During a brief lull in the gunfight, Marcus heard a voice shouting orders in accented English. Someone was trying to organize the defense, and that someone might be his target. The voice came from the floor above, confirming that Hassan al-Mahmoud was indeed in the building. Fighting his way to the staircase leading to the third floor required every tactical skill Marcus possessed. The enemy had positioned fighters to cover all approaches, turning the building into a deadly maze. He used grenades salvaged from neutralized fighters to clear defensive positions, each explosion echoing through the confined space like thunder. The staircase to the third floor was a killing zone, covered by multiple firing positions. Marcus studied the angles carefully, identifying the minimum exposure route that might allow him to reach the upper level. It would require split-second timing and considerable luck. He prepared for what he knew might be his final assault. Everything had led to this moment. Months of training, years of preparation, and the mission that had cost his teammates their lives. Failure was not an option, regardless of the personal cost. The charge up the stairs was a blur of violence and controlled desperation. Marcus moved faster than his enemies could react, using their confusion and the narrow confines of the staircase to prevent them from bringing their superior numbers to bear effectively. 2 fighters fell to his accurate fire before the others could adjust their positions. Reaching the third floor, Marcus found himself in a corridor lined with doors. Behind one of these doors was Hassan al-Mahmoud, the bomb maker whose death could save countless innocent lives. But which door, and how many defenders, stood between Marcus and his objective? The answer came in the form of automatic weapons fire erupting from the room at the end of the corridor. Multiple muzzle flashes lit up the narrow space as fighters opened fire from a prepared defensive position. Marcus dove for cover, realizing that his target had turned the entire floor into a fortress designed to repel exactly this kind of assault. As bullets filled the air around him, Marcus began to understand the true magnitude of what he had undertaken. This wasn't just about eliminating a single high-value target anymore. He had walked into the heart of a major enemy stronghold, alone and with minimal ammunition, facing odds that would challenge an entire squad of soldiers. Marcus pressed himself against the corridor wall as bullets continued to tear through the air where he had been standing moments before. His ammunition was critically low. Less than 20 rounds remaining. The defensive position at the end of the corridor was well organized and heavily armed. But he had come too far to retreat now. Through the chaos of gunfire, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. The distinctive sound of a radio transmission, crackling with static but clearly audible above the noise of battle. Someone was calling for reinforcements, and Marcus realized that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. He needed to end this quickly, before additional enemy forces arrived and made his situation completely impossible. The layout of the building worked against him. Only one corridor led to the target's position, and it was completely covered by defensive fire. A frontal assault would be suicide. Marcus remembered his urban warfare training and the principles of asymmetric combat. When facing superior numbers and firepower, the key was to do something unexpected, something the enemy wasn't prepared for. He studied the building's construction, noting the aged concrete walls and the damage from previous conflicts. Above him, Marcus could see where artillery shells had weakened the ceiling structure. Large cracks ran through the concrete, and several sections looked ready to collapse under stress. It was dangerous, but it might provide the element of surprise he desperately needed. Using the butt of his rifle, Marcus began striking one of the largest cracks in the ceiling. The concrete was old and weakened by years of conflict, and his efforts quickly opened a hole large enough to climb through. Debris rained down as he worked, but the sound was masked by the ongoing gunfight below. Pulling himself up into the space between floors, Marcus found himself in a maze of support beams, electrical conduits, and ventilation ducts. The space was cramped and dark, but it offered a way to bypass the defensive position that had pinned him down in the corridor. Moving carefully through the confined space, Marcus navigated toward where he estimated the target's room would be located. The sounds of shouting and movement below guided his progress as he crawled through the building's infrastructure. His wounded shoulder screamed with pain, but he ignored it and pressed forward. Through gaps in the flooring, Marcus could see into the room where the heaviest concentration of defenders had gathered. Hassan al-Mahmoud was there, a thin man with graying hair who was frantically destroying documents and computer equipment. Several bodyguards surrounded him, their weapons trained on the corridor where they expected Marcus to appear. This was the moment everything had led to. Marcus positioned himself directly above the target's location and prepared to drop through the ceiling. He would have only seconds to complete his mission before the bodyguards could react. There would be no second chance. Marcus took a deep breath, said a silent prayer for his fallen teammates, and dropped through the ceiling into the room below. The surprise was complete. None of the defenders had expected an assault from above. Marcus landed hard but rolled to absorb the impact, his rifle already coming up to engage targets. The room erupted into chaos as bodyguards spun to face this new threat. Marcus's superior training and the advantage of surprise allowed him to engage multiple targets before they could bring their weapons to bear. Years of marksmanship practice paid off as each shot found its mark with deadly precision. Hassan al-Mahmoud tried to flee through a side door, but Marcus was faster. A single well-aimed shot ended the career of one of the region's most dangerous bomb makers. The man who had been responsible for countless deaths finally faced justice for his actions. But the mission wasn't over yet. Documents and computer equipment scattered around the room contained intelligence that could save many lives. Marcus quickly gathered everything he could carry, stuffing hard drives and papers into his gear while remaining alert for additional threats. The sound of vehicles approaching outside told Marcus that enemy reinforcements were arriving. His escape route through the ceiling was no longer viable. He needed to find another way out of the building before he was completely surrounded. A window at the far end of the room offered a potential escape route to the building's roof. Marcus shot out the glass and looked down to see enemy fighters positioning themselves around the compound's perimeter. Going down wasn't an option, but the rooftops might offer a way to evade the closing net. Climbing onto the roof, Marcus found himself exposed but with a clear view of the surrounding area. The enemy forces were concentrating around the building's exits, expecting him to try to escape at ground level. This gave him a brief opportunity to move across the rooftops toward a possible extraction point. Moving from building to building required careful timing and athletic ability. Each jump was a calculated risk, with the ever-present danger of enemy fighters spotting his movement and engaging him with small arms fire. Marcus's military conditioning served him well as he navigated the urban obstacle course. 3 blocks from the original compound, Marcus spotted something that filled him with hope. An American military vehicle moving through the streets with a full squad of soldiers. His teammates had survived the convoy ambush and were conducting a search and rescue operation. Getting their attention without exposing himself to enemy fire required careful planning. Marcus used a signal mirror from his survival kit to reflect sunlight toward the patrol, flashing the identification codes he had memorized during training. The response was immediate. The patrol altered course toward his position. The reunion with his surviving teammates was emotional but brief. Corporal Johnson had a bandaged head wound, but was operational. Private Martinez had suffered burns, but insisted on participating in the rescue mission. Sergeant Thompson had coordinated the search effort, despite his own injuries from the convoy attack. The extraction was conducted under fire, as enemy forces converged on their position. Marcus's intelligence gathering had provided his team with valuable information about enemy positions and capabilities, making their withdrawal more effective. The documents and computer equipment he had recovered would provide intelligence analysts with insights into future terrorist operations. Back at base, Marcus underwent medical treatment for his wounds and participated in extensive debriefing sessions. The intelligence he had gathered led to several successful operations against terrorist cells throughout the region. Hassan al-Mahmoud's death disrupted a major bomb-making network and prevented numerous planned attacks. The mission that had started as a routine extraction had become something much larger, a demonstration of what one determined soldier could accomplish against overwhelming odds. Marcus's actions earned him recognition from his superiors and the gratitude of countless civilians whose lives had been saved by his courage. But for Marcus, the real victory was simpler than any military decoration. He had completed his mission and brought his teammates home alive. In a war where success was often measured in small increments, that was everything that mattered. The abandoned city of Kandahar continued its cycle of conflict and reconstruction. But for one brief moment, a single soldier had made a difference that would ripple through countless lives. In the broader context of the war, it was just one operation among thousands. For the families who would never lose loved ones to Hassan al-Mahmoud's bombs, it was everything. Marcus returned to duty the following week, his shoulder healed, and his resolve stronger than ever. The war would continue, bringing new challenges and new missions. But he now knew with absolute certainty that one person, properly trained and sufficiently motivated, could indeed stand against an entire war zone and emerge victorious. The lessons learned during those terrifying hours in enemy territory would stay with Marcus for the rest of his military career. Leadership under pressure, tactical innovation, and the importance of never giving up had been tested in the crucible of real combat. Most importantly, he had learned that the mission always comes first, but bringing your team home safely is what makes it all worthwhile. Years later, when Marcus had returned to civilian life, he would sometimes dream about that day in Kandahar. Not nightmares, but dreams of pride and accomplishment. He had been tested in the ultimate arena and had not been found wanting. In a world that often seemed chaotic and meaningless, that knowledge provided a foundation of strength that would serve him for the rest of his life.